They say there was once a cartographer who drew not what was, but what ought to be. His maps didn't reflect the world. They compelled the world to reflect them. And when a wise man asked if he feared such power, the cartographer replied, "I fear only one thing, that I might someday err in a line." Fyodor was not such a cartographer. He was merely a restorer. In his quiet workshop, smelling of paste and ancient dust, other worlds found a second life. He mended parchment wounds, infused faded river veins with new vitality, and under his fingers, decayed continents solidified once more. It was a craft for the patient, a craft for the unnoticed. But Fyodor yearned to be noticed. His shadow, his eternal reproach, was Lev, a colleague whose name resonated in the narrow circles of connoisseurs. Lev's voice was a full-flowing river, his confidence a rich velvet, and even his most ordinary ideas he presented as revelations. They were currently working on the same project, the restoration of a 17th century atlas, and Fyodor knew that all the glory, as always, would go not to his hands, but to Lev's voice. All the meticulous work, all the sleepless nights over fragile sheets, would be relegated to a footnote in the catalogue, while Lev would bask in recognition. This injustice was an old, dull thorn in Fyodor's heart. It was then that he found it. Tucked behind the lining of the leather binding, in a hidden compartment that shouldn't have existed, lay a sheet folded into quarters. It was not a map of land or stars. It was a map of a human face. The parchment, thin as an eyelid, was not covered in rivers and mountains, but in lines, fine as cobwebs, converging at the eyes, at the curve of the lips, at the temples. Lines of fate, lines of will, lines of fortune. The face on the map was nobody's, neither male nor female. It was a vessel awaiting a name. Fyodor initially set the find aside, deeming it some alchemical oddity, but the image of the faceless countenance lingered in his mind. One night, when the bitterness of Lev's latest success became almost physical, he retrieved the map. Gazing at it, he thought of Lev, of his eyes always looking with a slight, condescending squint. Fyodor's finger, as if guided by an alien will, rested upon the parchment. He didn't press, didn't scratch. He merely shifted one of the tiny lines that webbed around the left eye of the drawn face. Just a movement, meaningless and light. The next day, Lev was scheduled to speak before the commission. And he did speak. But his confidence was shattered. His left eyelid began to twitch, a small, unsightly tremor, like the flutter of a trapped moth's wing. It unsettled him, muddled his thoughts, turning the full, flowing river of his speech into a sputtering brook. For the first time, the commission paid attention not to the orator, but to the work itself, to the impeccable seams and restored colors, to Fyodor's work. He told himself it was a coincidence, a chance occurrence layered with desire, but a chilling certainty had already taken root in his soul. A week later, when the fate of the entire project was being decided, he unrolled the map again. This time, his hand was steadier. He found the line that ran from the larynx to the lips, the line of speech. He didn't tear it. He, the restorer, merely made a tiny correction. With his fingernail, he created a barely perceptible curve, a tiny obstruction on its smooth path. At the final meeting, Lev couldn't string two words together. He stammered, choked on air. His famous voice was reduced to a pathetic bleat. The project was completely handed over to Fyodor. That evening in his workshop, in the silence of his triumph, Fyodor looked at the map. He was not a destroyer. No. He was a restorer of justice. He didn't break what belonged to others. He merely corrected the map, restoring to the world the balance it had been deprived of. Power proved not to be intoxicating wine, but a saline solution that only sharpened his thirst. Triumph brought no peace. The silence in the workshop, once a comfort, now pressed down like a column of water. Every rustle of parchment felt like a reproach. Every manuscript he restored, a silent witness to his deception. He received recognition, contracts, respectful bows in the corridors. But it was all flat, like bread without salt, because deep down he knew he hadn't won. He had merely sabotaged his rival's race. He was not a master, but a thief who had stolen not a thing, but another's very essence. Lev vanished from the institute. At first, there were rumors of humiliation, of a nervous breakdown. Fyodor listened to them with a cold satisfaction, which he immediately extinguished like a candle, ashamed of its acrid smoke. He told himself that everything was going according to plan, that balance had been restored. But one evening, as he was locking up his workshop, she found him. Anna, Lev's wife. She didn't cry, didn't scream. Her face was like a faded tapestry from which all vibrant colors had drained, leaving only the gray weave of sorrow. She quietly asked if Fyodor knew what might have happened. "He's different," she said, her voice fragile, like old glass. "He's home, but he's not there. He looks at me, but doesn't see." The doctors shrug, saying his mind is clear, but as if emptied. As if someone entered the house of his memory and removed all the furniture, leaving bare walls. In that moment, Fyodor understood that his minor corrections, his restoration of justice, were merely a prelude. Anna looked at him with hope, seeing in him the only person who had been close to Lev in his final working weeks. And that hope was more unbearable than any accusation. In her eyes, he saw not only love for her husband, but also the reflection of his own insignificance. Even broken, emptied, Lev possessed a treasure Fyodor never had. He was loved. This love protected him, made him real even in his absence. And this reality poisoned Fyodor's victory. That night he unrolled the map again. The face on it seemed to mock him in the lamplight. He no longer deceived himself. This was not a thirst for justice. This was envy, black and thick as tar. Envy of another's talent, another's voice, another's love. He realized that as long as Lev remembered who he was, as long as Anna remembered whom she loved, his, Fyodor's, triumph was merely a temporary illusion. Lev could recover. His voice could return. But what if he erased the very foundation? What if he removed not just one cog from the clockwork, but the mainspring itself? His hands, accustomed to the finest work, did not tremble. He took his sharpest scalpel, the one intended for separating stuck pages of ancient folios. He looked at the map, at the intricate pattern of lines interwoven across the forehead and temples. This was the citadel of reason, a treasury of memory. He wasn't going to tear. A restorer doesn't tear. He carefully, with surgical precision, hooked the tip under one of the central threads, the one that seemed to him the axis upon which all others were strung. He didn't cut it. He slowly, millimeter by millimeter, began to pull it from the parchment surface. The line yielded, thinning like a cobweb in the wind. With it, neighboring patterns weakened, their complex weave dissolving into a chaotic jumble of strokes. He was unpicking the soul from its casing. When the main thread was extracted, only a pale furrow remained on the parchment, the empty bed of a dried-up river. But this was not enough. The void had to be sealed. From scraps of clean, untouched 17th century parchment, the same age as the atlas, he cut a tiny patch, the size of a pinky fingernail. He mixed his best glue, applied a very thin layer, and placed this virgin patch over the spot where thought had just pulsed. He smoothed it with a bone folder until it was completely indistinguishable. It was his best work. A flawless restoration. No one would ever guess that anything had been there. On the map, in the center of the faceless countenance's forehead, now shone a smooth, even, empty spot, a seal of oblivion. The next day, Anna called him. Her voice was dead. Lev had woken up that morning, sat on the bed, and politely inquired who she was and what she was doing in his room. There was no panic or madness in his eyes. Only calm, clear, bottomless ignorance. He had become an ideal vessel, perfectly restored, but forever empty. Fyodor hung up. Silence reigned in the workshop. He went to the mirror and looked at his reflection. But he saw not himself, only the empty, smooth spot on the map, his best, his last work. He hadn't merely erased another. He had carved out a part of the world, and now in its place, a perpetual, man-made emptiness seeped through. Emptiness tolerates no boundaries. It seeps through the cracks of creation like marsh gas. The next day, Fyodor, passing by colleagues, heard them discussing that very atlas. They praised him, Fyodor, for having undertaken such a complex project alone. Alone, from scratch, said a gray-haired curator, and there was not a shadow of doubt in his voice. Fyodor stopped. Not entirely alone, he corrected, and the words felt like lead on his tongue. Lev was originally leading it. The curator looked at him with polite bewilderment, as if Fyodor had spoken in a dead dialect. Lev? He repeated. We've never had anyone named Lev on staff. A chill, unrelated to any draft from the windows, ran down Fyodor's spine. He rushed to the archive. He sifted through payrolls, appointment orders, ledgers. His fingers, accustomed to the fragility of centuries, frantically turned through thick modern paper. The name Lev was not there. Nowhere. Not crossed out, not smeared. It simply had never existed. All documents related to the project were perfect. From the very beginning, Only one name was on them. His, Fyodor. He found her address. He ran through the streets, heedless of his path, driven by a terror sharper and deeper than guilt. He had to see her, Anna. To see the sorrow on her face, that faded tapestry. It was the only proof that his crime was real, that Lev had existed. She opened the door, but there was no trace of sadness on her face. It was calm, almost blooming. She looked at him like a stranger, with slight irritation at his persistent knocking. "Who are you looking for?" she asked. "Anna. It's me, Fyodor, Lev's colleague." She frowned. "You're mistaken. I don't know anyone named Lev, and I've never had a husband." And behind her, in the depths of the apartment, where before there had been the silence of an emptied home, music and laughter now sounded. There was another life, whole and intact, built on a foundation from which he had removed the keystone. He returned to the workshop like a thief returning to the scene of the crime. He knew what he would see even before he turned on the light. The map lay on the table. It had changed. The flawless patch, his seal of oblivion, had vanished. But the emptiness in its place had not healed. On the contrary, it had spread like an ink stain on wet fabric. It had devoured the fine lines of will at the temples, erased the pattern of fortune around the curve of the lips. Almost the entire face on the parchment had become a smooth, clean, unscribed field. Almost all. In the very center of this whiteness, like the first shoots on scorched earth, new strokes emerged. With a trembling hand, Fyodor brought his magnifying glass closer. These were not chaotic scratches. It was a pattern. Familiar. He staggered back from the table, knocking over a jar of paste. From the void, his own eyes stared back at him. The map was no longer nobody's. Now it had a name. He became the keeper of the world's only memory of a man who had never existed. He received everything he desired: fame, recognition, uniqueness. But he was bound to this parchment sheet, like a cursed king to his throne. For he was a restorer. He could not destroy the map. That would be self-annihilation. He could only eternally maintain it, glue new patches over the spreading void, reinforce the thinning lines of his own soul. He was not a cartographer who changed the world. He became the map that the world was slowly and irrevocably erasing.